Marcus Thompson had always believed his family tree was as ordinary as they came. Growing up in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, with his single mother Sarah, he never questioned their simple lifestyle or wondered about the father he'd never known. His mother worked double shifts at the local diner, her hands permanently stained with coffee and grease, her smile tired but genuine whenever she tucked him into bed with stories of her own childhood in rural Kentucky. The 34-year-old accountant lived a predictable life. He woke up at 6:30 each morning, prepared his standard breakfast of toast and black coffee, and walked the same route to his office at Henderson and Associates. His colleagues knew him as Reliable Marcus, the guy who never missed a deadline and always brought homemade cookies to office parties. He drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, lived in a studio apartment overlooking a parking lot, and spent his weekends reading mystery novels and tending to his small collection of houseplants. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday morning in October when Marcus received an unexpected phone call. He was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed with an unknown international number. Normally, he would have let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Mr. Thompson?" The voice carried a distinct British accent, formal and precise. "My name is Jonathan Whitmore, and I represent the law firm of Pemberton, Hastings, and Associates in London. I'm calling regarding a matter of inheritance that may concern you." Marcus almost laughed. Inheritance? The only thing his family had ever inherited was debt and disappointment. "I think you have the wrong person," he said, already reaching to hang up. "Please, Mr. Thompson, if I may have just a moment of your time. Are you the son of Sarah Louise Thompson, formerly Sarah Louise Mitchell, born in Bowling Green, Kentucky in 1965? The specificity of the information made Marcus pause. His mother had indeed been born in Bowling Green, though she rarely spoke about her early years there. "How did you get this information?" "Mr. Thompson, I represent the estate of Lady Catherine Pembroke, who passed away 6 months ago. Her will contain specific instructions to locate any living descendants of the Mitchell family line. Our investigation has led us to you." Marcus felt his coffee mug slip slightly in his hand. Lady Catherine Pembroke? The name meant nothing to him, but the formal tone of the lawyer made his pulse quicken. "I'm sorry, but I've never heard of any Lady Pembroke. My family doesn't have any connections to nobility or anything like that." "That's precisely why I'm calling, Mr. Thompson. Lady Pembroke's final wishes included provisions for a comprehensive ancestry investigation. She believed there were family connections that had been, shall we say, deliberately obscured over the years. Would you be willing to participate in genetic testing to verify potential lineage?" The absurdity of the situation struck Marcus. Here he was, sitting in his cramped cubicle, being asked to take genetic tests by a British lawyer claiming he might be connected to nobility. What exactly would this involve? "A simple DNA test, completely at our expense, of course. If the results confirm what Lady Pembroke suspected, there would be significant financial implications for you. The estate is quite substantial." Marcus's practical mind immediately went to scams. "How do I know this is legitimate?" "I understand your skepticism, Mr. Thompson. I'm prepared to send you our firm's credentials, references from the British legal system, and documentation from Lady Pembroke's will. You can verify everything independently. All I ask is that you consider the possibility that your family history may be more complex than you've been led to believe." After the call ended, Marcus sat staring at his computer screen, the quarterly reports forgotten. He tried to focus on work, but his mind kept wandering to the conversation. During his lunch break, he called his mother. "Mom, I had the strangest phone call today," he began, settling into his car in the parking lot. "Someone claiming to be a British lawyer asking about our family history." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. What did they want to know? Something in his mother's tone made Marcus pay closer attention. "They mentioned the Mitchell family name, asked about your birth in Kentucky. Mom, is there something about our family that you haven't told me?" Another pause. "Marcus, honey, you know I've always been private about my childhood. Some things are better left in the past." But this lawyer mentioned Lady Catherine Pembroke, said she believed there were family connections that had been hidden. "Do you know that name?" The silence stretched so long that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, his mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see you tonight. Can you come for dinner?" That evening, Marcus drove to his mother's small house in the suburbs, his mind racing with questions. He found her in the kitchen, mechanically stirring a pot of soup, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something he'd never seen before: fear. "Mom, what's going on? You're scaring me." Sarah Thompson set down her spoon and turned to face her son. In the fluorescent light of the kitchen, Marcus noticed how much older she looked, lines around her eyes that seemed deeper than they had that morning. "Marcus, I need to tell you something that I should have told you years ago. But first, you need to understand that everything I did was to protect you." She led him to the living room, where she pulled out a small wooden box from behind some books on the shelf. With trembling hands, she opened it and withdrew a faded photograph and several yellowed documents. "Your father wasn't just some random guy who left us," she began, her voice shaking. "His name was James Pembroke, and he was complicated." Marcus took the photograph. It showed a young woman who was clearly his mother, standing next to a tall, dark-haired man in what appeared to be formal dress. They were standing in front of an impressive building that looked distinctly British. "That was taken in London in 1988. I was 23, working as a nanny for wealthy families. James was charming, educated, and completely out of my league. I thought I was living in a fairy tale." "Pembroke," Marcus repeated slowly, "as in Lady Catherine Pembroke." His mother nodded. "James's aunt. She was the head of the family, controlled the estate, the money, everything. When she found out about our relationship, about you—" Sarah's voice trailed off. "What happened? She made it very clear that a working-class American girl was not suitable for the Pembroke family. She offered me money to disappear, to never contact James again, to never tell you about your father." Marcus felt the world shifting beneath him. "You took the money." "I was young, scared, and pregnant. I had no family support, no resources. The money she offered was more than I'd ever seen in my life. Enough to come back to America, start over, raise you properly." "And you never told him about me." Tears began flowing down Sarah's cheeks. "I tried to once. When you were about 5, I called the family estate. Lady Catherine answered personally. She told me that James had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. She said that if I ever contacted the family again, she would make sure I regretted it." Marcus stared at the photograph, trying to process this information. The man in the picture looked kind, with eyes similar to his own. "So this Lady Catherine knew about me all along." "She must have. That's the only explanation for why a lawyer would be calling you now." Marcus spent the next hour asking questions, learning details about a father he'd never known and a family legacy that had been deliberately hidden from him. His mother showed him letters James had written, expressing his love for her and his excitement about becoming a father. She showed him the airline tickets she'd bought, but never used for a planned trip back to London. "I've lived with this guilt for 35 years, Sarah said. "Every time you asked about your father, every time you struggled because we didn't have enough money, I wondered if I'd made the right choice." That night, Marcus returned to his apartment with his head spinning. He spread the documents his mother had given him across his kitchen table and studied them for hours. Birth certificates, old passport pages, love letters written in elegant handwriting. The evidence painted a picture of a romance that had been cut short by family politics and social class differences. The next morning, Marcus called Jonathan Whitmore back. "I'd like to take that DNA test," he said without preamble. "Excellent, Mr. Thompson. I can have a testing kit sent to you immediately. The results typically take 2 to 3 weeks." "Can you tell me more about Lady Catherine? About why she would leave provisions for finding me after keeping me hidden all these years?" Whitmore's voice became more formal. "I'm not privy to all the details of Lady Catherine's motivations, but I can tell you that she made several significant changes to her will in the months before her death. Our understanding is that she had come to regret certain decisions from her past." 3 weeks later, Marcus received a call that would change everything. The DNA test had confirmed what Lady Catherine had suspected. Marcus was indeed James Pembroke's son, making him the direct heir to a substantial portion of the Pembroke estate. The inheritance includes the family's primary residence in Surrey, several investment properties, and a trust fund valued at approximately £12 million, Whitmore explained during their video call. "However, there are certain conditions attached to the inheritance." Marcus, who had been packing around his apartment, sat down heavily. "What kind of conditions?" Lady Catherine's will requires that any heir must spend at least 1 year living at the family estate, learning about the family history, and meeting certain family obligations. She wanted to ensure that the Pembroke legacy would continue in appropriate hands. What if I refuse? Then the inheritance would go to a charitable trust. But Mr. Thompson, I should mention that there's one more thing. Lady Catherine left a personal message for you, to be delivered only after the DNA results were confirmed. Whitmore's image on the video call moved aside as he opened a sealed envelope. She wrote, "Marcus, if you are reading this, then you are indeed my brother's grandson, and I have spent 35 years making the greatest mistake of my life. I separated you from your father and your heritage because of my own prejudices and fears. I cannot undo the pain I caused your mother, or the relationship you never had with James, but I can try to give you the life that should have been yours from the beginning. The choice is yours, but know that you have always belonged here, and it is my deepest hope that you will come home." Marcus felt tears he hadn't expected threatening to fall. Here was acknowledgement from a woman he'd never met, an apology for decisions that had shaped his entire life, and an invitation to a world he'd never imagined he could be part of. "I need time to think about this," Marcus managed to say. "Of course, Mr. Thompson, but I should mention that there are legal deadlines involved. You have 90 days from today to make your decision." After the call ended, Marcus sat in his silent apartment, looking around at his modest life. Everything he'd known about himself, about his family, about his future, had been turned upside down in a matter of weeks. He thought about his mother, working double shifts to support them. He thought about the father he'd never known, who had apparently died without ever learning about his son. And he thought about Lady Catherine, a woman who had spent the last decades of her life trying to correct a mistake that had affected multiple generations. That evening, Marcus called his mother again. "I got the results," he said simply. "And it's all true, Mom. I'm James Pembroke's son. Lady Catherine left me an inheritance worth millions of dollars, but I have to live in England for a year to claim it." The silence on the other end was deafening. "What are you going to do?" Sarah finally asked. Marcus looked around his apartment, at his simple life, at his predictable future. "I honestly don't know. This changes everything, doesn't it?" "Yes," his mother said softly. "I suppose it does." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that the call from Jonathan Whitmore hadn't just offered him money or property. It had offered him a chance to discover who he really was, to connect with a heritage that had been deliberately hidden from him, and to perhaps understand the father he'd never known. But it also meant leaving behind everything familiar, everything safe, everything he'd built for himself in his ordinary life. The next morning, Marcus went to work as usual, but found himself unable to concentrate on his tasks. His colleagues noticed his distraction, but he couldn't explain what was happening. How do you tell people that you've discovered you're the heir to a British estate? How do you explain that your entire life story had been rewritten in the span of a few weeks? During his lunch break, Marcus found himself researching the Pembroke family online. What he found was fascinating and overwhelming. The Pembrokes had been prominent in British society for centuries, with connections to politics, business, and philanthropy. There were photos of elaborate family estates, newspaper clippings about charitable donations, and society page mentions of various family members at important events. And there, in a 1990 obituary, he found his father. James Pembroke, aged 28, had died in a car accident while driving back from a business meeting in Scotland. The obituary mentioned his work with children's charities and his love of literature. It described him as a devoted son and nephew, but made no mention of any family in America. Marcus printed the obituary and stared at it for a long time. This was the man who should have been his father, whose absence had shaped his entire childhood. The man who had written love letters to his mother and had planned to build a life with her. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He requested a meeting with his supervisor and submitted his resignation, giving 2 weeks' notice. When asked about his plans, he simply said he was moving abroad for family reasons. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations and difficult conversations. Marcus's mother was supportive but worried, uncertain about her son moving so far away. His few close friends were stunned by his sudden decision to leave his stable job and comfortable life. "Are you sure about this?" his best friend David asked during their farewell dinner. "You're giving up everything you've built here for people you've never met." Marcus considered the question seriously. Maybe that's exactly why I need to do this. I've spent my whole life not knowing where I came from, building an identity based on incomplete information. This is my chance to understand the other half of my story. On his last day at work, Marcus cleaned out his desk and said goodbye to colleagues who had become like family over the years. As he walked out of the Henderson and Associates building for the final time, he felt a mixture of terror and excitement that he hadn't experienced since college. That evening, he called Jonathan Whitmore to confirm his decision. "I'll take the inheritance," Marcus said. "When do I need to be in England?" "Wonderful news, Mr. Thompson. I can arrange for your travel and accommodation. The estate has been maintained in your absence, and there's a full staff to help with your transition. Shall we say 2 weeks from today?" 2 weeks, Marcus repeated, the reality of his decision hitting him fully for the first time. "There is one more thing, Mr. Thompson. Lady Catherine's will mention that there would be certain family documents and information available to you once you arrived. She apparently kept extensive records about your father and the circumstances surrounding your birth. She wanted you to have the full truth." Marcus felt his heart skip. "What kind of truth?" "I'm afraid I don't have the details. Lady Catherine was very specific that certain information should only be revealed to you in person at the family estate. But I believe you'll find it quite illuminating." As Marcus prepared for bed that night, he realized that his journey was just beginning. The phone call that had started everything was leading him toward discoveries he couldn't even imagine. In 2 weeks, he would be walking into a life that should have been his from the beginning, but he had no idea what he would find when he got there. Marcus's first glimpse of Pembroke Manor came through the window of a black sedan as it wound through the Surrey countryside on a crisp November morning. He had expected something impressive, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of seeing his family's ancestral home. The manor house rose from perfectly manicured grounds like something from a period drama, its honey-colored stone glowing in the pale autumn sunlight. Tall windows reflected the surrounding parkland, and an imposing front door was flanked by columns that spoke of centuries of history. "Quite something, isn't it, sir?" said the driver, a middle-aged man named Peter who had introduced himself as the estate manager. "Been in your family for nearly 400 years. Marcus could only nod, his throat tight with emotion. The phrase, "your family," still sounded foreign to him. Just 3 weeks ago, he had been living in a studio apartment in Cleveland. Now he was approaching a house that belonged to him, that had always belonged to him by right of birth. The car pulled up to the front entrance, where a small group of people waited on the steps. Jonathan Whitmore was immediately recognizable from their video calls, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Beside him stood a woman who appeared to be in her 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind understated glasses. "Welcome home, Mr. Thompson," Whitmore said as Marcus stepped out of the car. "I'm delighted to finally meet you in person. This is Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, the estate's head housekeeper. She's been maintaining Pembroke Manor for the past 15 years. Mrs. Harrison stepped forward with a warm smile that immediately put Marcus at ease. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. We've all been looking forward to your arrival. Lady Catherine spoke about you often in her final months." "She did," Marcus asked, surprised, "but she'd never met me." "Oh, but she felt as though she knew you," Mrs. Harrison replied. "She had investigators provide regular reports about your life over the years. She knew about your education, your career, your character. She was quite proud, actually." The revelation was startling. While Marcus had been living his quiet life in Ohio, completely unaware of his heritage, his great-aunt had been watching from afar, following his progress through hired investigators. It was both touching and unsettling to realize that his privacy had been quietly invaded for years, even if the intentions had been good. Whitmore led the group through the massive front door into an entrance hall that took Marcus's breath away. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, supported by carved columns. A grand staircase curved upward, its banisters polished to a gleaming finish. Portraits lined the walls, faces from centuries past gazing down with varying expressions of dignity and authority. "These are your ancestors," Mrs. Harrison said, noticing Marcus's fascination with the paintings. "Lady Catherine maintained detailed genealogical records. She'll be able to tell you exactly how you're related to each person here." "She will?" Marcus asked. "I thought Lady Catherine had passed away." Mrs. Harrison and Whitmore exchanged a glance that Marcus couldn't interpret. "Perhaps we should get you settled first," Whitmore said smoothly. "There's quite a lot to discuss, and you must be tired from your journey." Mrs. Harrison led Marcus up the grand staircase to the second floor, where she opened the door to what she called the Blue Suite. The rooms were larger than Marcus's entire apartment had been, decorated in soft blues and creams with furniture that looked both antique and comfortable. Tall windows overlooked gardens that seemed to stretch to the horizon. "These were your father's rooms when he was your age," Mrs. Harrison said quietly. "Lady Catherine had them restored to exactly how they were in 1989, just before," she trailed off. "Before he died," Marcus finished. "Yes, sir, she wanted you to feel connected to him when you arrived." Marcus walked slowly through the sitting room, the bedroom, and a small study lined with bookshelves. On the desk sat a photograph he recognized from his mother's collection, James Pembroke at university, laughing with a group of friends. But there were other photos here too, ones Marcus had never seen. James as a child, riding horses on the estate grounds. James at formal family gatherings, always looking slightly uncomfortable in elegant clothing. James with Lady Catherine, both of them smiling genuinely at something outside the camera's view. "They were close?" Marcus asked, touching the frame of the last photo. "Very close," Mrs. Harrison confirmed. "James was like a son to Lady Catherine. When his parents died in that boating accident when he was 16, she raised him herself. His death nearly destroyed her." That evening, Marcus joined Whitmore for dinner in a dining room that could have seated 20 people. The table had been set for 2 at one end, creating a more intimate atmosphere despite the room's grandeur. A fire crackled in the massive fireplace, casting warm light on dark wood paneling. "I imagine this is all quite overwhelming," Whitmore said as they were served the first course by a quiet woman who introduced herself simply as Agnes. "That's putting it mildly," Marcus replied. "This morning I was Marcus Thompson, accountant from Cleveland. Tonight I'm apparently the heir to all this. I keep waiting to wake up." Whitmore smiled sympathetically. "Lady Catherine anticipated that you might feel that way. That's actually why she structured the inheritance as she did. She wanted you to have time to adjust, to learn about the family and the responsibilities that come with the estate." "What kind of responsibilities?" "The Pembroke family has been involved in various charitable endeavors for generations. There are several foundations that require oversight, tenant farmers whose livelihoods depend on the estate's agricultural operations, and local community projects that the family has traditionally supported. It's not simply about inheriting wealth, Marcus. It's about inheriting a legacy of service." After dinner, Whitmore led Marcus to the library, a room that immediately became his favorite space in the house. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, with rolling ladders providing access to the higher shelves. Comfortable leather chairs were arranged around reading lamps, and a fire warmed the space with a gentle glow. "Lady Catherine spent most of her time here in her final years," Whitmore said, settling into one of the chairs. "She left specific instructions about what you should be shown first." He walked to a particular section of shelving and removed what appeared to be a false front, revealing a hidden cabinet behind. From this, he withdrew a leather-bound journal and several manila folders. "Lady Catherine's private papers," he explained, setting them on the table between the chairs. "Her personal account of what happened in 1989 and what she learned in the years that followed." Marcus opened the journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated just 6 months before Lady Catherine's death. "If Marcus is reading this, then I have finally found the courage to face the greatest mistake of my life. For 35 years, I have lived with the knowledge that my pride and prejudice robbed my beloved nephew of his son, robbed a loving woman of her partner, and robbed a child of his birthright. I can only hope that by telling the full truth now, I can begin to make amends for the damage I caused." The entries that followed painted a picture that was more complex than anything Marcus had imagined. Lady Catherine had not simply disapproved of his mother's relationship with James because of class differences. She had been afraid that James would abandon the family responsibilities that she had spent years preparing him to assume. The Pembroke estate was more than just wealth. It was the foundation for charitable work that affected thousands of people. "James had already told me he wanted to move to America," one entry read. "He said he was tired of the expectations, the formal dinners, the board meetings for foundations he'd never chosen to support. He wanted a simple life with Sarah away from all of this. I panicked. If James left, who would continue the work? Who would maintain the traditions? In my fear, I made choices that I have regretted every day since. Marcus read for hours, learning about his father's personality in ways his mother's stories had never revealed. James had been brilliant but restless, passionate about literature and social justice, but constrained by the formal expectations of his position. He had chafed against the structured life Lady Catherine had planned for him, longing for something more authentic and personally meaningful. The irony, Lady Catherine had written, is that by driving James away from Sarah, I lost him completely anyway. After the accident, I realized that I had sacrificed my relationship with the person I loved most in the world for nothing. The estate continued to function, the charities continued their work, but the heart had gone out of everything. As Marcus continued reading, he discovered that Lady Catherine's surveillance of his life hadn't been as simple as hearing investigators to file reports. She had been actively, though secretly, involved in his life for years. I made sure that scholarship money was available when Marcus wanted to attend university, one entry revealed. I ensured that his mother's diner received a loan during difficult economic periods. I couldn't give them the open support they deserved, but I tried to help from the shadows. Marcus set down the journal, his mind reeling. The scholarship that had made college possible, the mysterious investor who had helped his mother avoid bankruptcy during the recession. These hadn't been lucky breaks or anonymous benefactors. They had been Lady Catherine trying to care for the family she had forced away. The next folder contained investigative reports spanning decades. Marcus read detailed accounts of his academic achievements, his career progression, even observations about his personality and character. One report from his university years noted his involvement in volunteer tutoring programs. Another mentioned his habit of bringing coffee to homeless individuals on his way to work. The subject demonstrates the same compassionate nature that characterized his father, one investigator had written. Despite limited financial resources, he consistently finds ways to help others. But it was the final folder that contained the most shocking revelation. Medical records, DNA analysis reports, and correspondence with various laboratories. Lady Catherine had been trying to confirm Marcus's paternity for years, not because she doubted it, but because she was preparing to reveal the truth. I commissioned the first DNA analysis in 2015, she had written. I needed to be absolutely certain before I took any action that might disrupt Marcus's life. When the results confirmed what I already knew in my heart, I began planning how to make things right. The journal entries from her final months revealed a woman wrestling with guilt and mortality. I am 78 years old, and I may not have much time left. I cannot die knowing that James's son is living a life so far beneath what he deserves. More importantly, I cannot die without giving Marcus the choice that I took away from his father. Marcus closed the journal as dawn light began filtering through the library windows. He had read through the entire night, absorbed in a story that was both his family's history and an explanation for the trajectory of his entire life. Lady Catherine emerged from these pages not as the cold aristocrat his mother remembered, but as a woman who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic and had spent decades trying to find a way to correct it. The next morning, Mrs. Harrison found Marcus still in the library, surrounded by the open files and papers. "Did you sleep at all, sir?" she asked gently, setting down a tray with coffee and fresh pastries. "I couldn't stop reading," Marcus admitted. "Mrs. Harrison, how well did you know Lady Catherine?" The housekeeper settled into the chair across from him. "Very well, sir. I've worked for the family for 15 years, but I've known Lady Catherine since I was a girl. My mother was her personal maid." "What was she like in her final months?" Mrs. Harrison was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "She was haunted, sir. She spent hours in here, writing in that journal, making phone calls to lawyers and investigators. She often said that she was running out of time to make things right." "Do you think she made the right choice, bringing me here?" "I think, sir, that Lady Catherine was a woman who loved her family deeply but sometimes loved them poorly. She made mistakes, but she spent the end of her life trying to correct them. Whether that's enough? Well, I suppose that's for you to decide." Later that morning, Whitmore found Marcus in the gardens behind the house, walking among rose bushes that were being prepared for winter. "I've read everything," Marcus said without preamble. "The journal, the reports, all of it." "And how do you feel about what you've learned?" Marcus stopped walking and looked back at the manor house, its windows gleaming in the morning sun. Confused, grateful, angry, sad, all at the same time. She was watching my entire life, helping from the shadows, but she never gave me the choice to know my father before he died. Lady Catherine was aware of that contradiction, Whitmore said. It's addressed in her will. She left you a significant sum beyond the inheritance, what she called compensation for lost time. She knew money couldn't restore your relationship with James, but she wanted to acknowledge the magnitude of what was taken from you. How much? £5 million, separate from the estate. She also left detailed instructions about how you might honor your father's memory if you choose to do so. That afternoon, Marcus was given a tour of the estate's operations. He met the tenant farmers whose families had worked the land for generations, visited the village school that the Pembroke Foundation had supported for decades, and saw the community center that provided services to elderly residents throughout the county. Your father was very involved in all of this, explained David Hartwell, the estate's agricultural manager. He had modern ideas about sustainable farming and social responsibility. Lady Catherine always said she hoped you might continue his work. Marcus found himself genuinely interested in the operations, asking detailed questions about crop rotation, environmental conservation efforts, and the economic challenges facing rural communities. His accounting background proved useful in understanding the financial structures that supported the various charitable endeavors. But it was his visit to the estate's archives that provided the most emotional moment of his first full day at Pembroke Manor. Hidden away in a climate-controlled room beneath the house, Mrs. Harrison showed him carefully preserved mementos of his father's life. Lady Catherine couldn't bear to display these after James died, she explained, opening cabinet after cabinet. But she couldn't bear to dispose of them either. There were school reports praising James's academic achievements, photographs from family holidays, letters he had written from university, even childhood drawings and school projects. But most moving were the items that revealed his relationship with Sarah. Love letters, ticket stubs from movies they had seen together in London, a small velvet box containing an engagement ring that had never been given. He was planning to propose, Marcus asked, holding the delicate ring up to the light. According to his journal, yes. Lady Catherine found these things in his room after the accident. The proposal was planned for Christmas of 1989. You would have been born just a few months later. Marcus felt tears he hadn't expected. This wasn't just the story of a relationship that had been cut short by family interference. This was the story of a man who had been planning to build a life with the woman he loved and the child he didn't know was coming. James Pembroke had died not knowing that he was about to become a father, and Marcus had grown up not knowing that his father had been preparing to marry his mother. That evening, Marcus placed a long-distance call to his mother. "I've learned more about Dad in 2 days than I knew in 34 years, he told her. "What did you find out?" "He was going to propose to you. He had bought a ring, made plans. He loved you more than Lady Catherine's journal could ever describe." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if the connection had been lost. "Mom." "I'm here," Sarah finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "He told me he had something important to ask me when he got back from his business trip. I always wondered. Lady Catherine has been helping us financially for years. The scholarship that got me through college, the investor who helped save the diner, that was her trying to take care of us from a distance." "I don't know how to feel about that," his mother admitted. "Part of me is grateful, but part of me is angry that she thought money could make up for what she took from us. I think she knew money couldn't make up for it, but I think she didn't know what else to do." Marcus spent the next week immersing himself in estate business, learning about the various foundations and charitable operations that he was now expected to oversee. He discovered that the Pembroke family's philanthropic work was extensive and genuinely impactful, providing everything from educational scholarships to rural healthcare funding. But it was during a visit to the estate's legal offices that Marcus uncovered information that would shake his understanding of his family's story once again. "There's something else Lady Catherine wanted you to know," Whitmore said, opening a final sealed file. "Something she couldn't bring herself to put in the journal." "What now?" Marcus asked, exhausted by the constant revelations. "Your father didn't die in a simple car accident," Whitmore said quietly. He was driving to Scotland to meet with investigators he had hired to find your mother. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He gripped the arms of his chair as Whitmore's revelation sank in. He was looking for us. According to the police investigation, James had contacted a private detective agency in Edinburgh 3 weeks before his death. He had been systematically searching for your mother ever since Lady Catherine told him she had returned to America. Marcus felt the room spin slightly. But Lady Catherine told my mother that James had died 2 years earlier when she called in 1991. That was a lie, Whitmore said gently. James was very much alive in 1991. In fact, that was around the time he intensified his search efforts. Lady Catherine intercepted your mother's call and saw it as another threat to her control over the situation. The lawyer opened the file and withdrew a thick stack of documents. These are copies of correspondence between James and various investigative agencies. He hired firms in Kentucky, Ohio, and 3 other states. He was determined to find Sarah and explain what had really happened. Marcus took the papers with shaking hands. The letters were written in the same elegant handwriting he recognized from the love letters his mother had saved. But these showed a different side of his father, desperate, frustrated, and increasingly frantic as each lead turned up nothing. I've spent 3 years searching for the woman I love and our child, read one letter to a detective in Louisville. My aunt told me they had died in an accident, but I've found no records to support this. I'm beginning to suspect I've been deliberately misled. Lady Catherine told him we were dead, Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It appears so. When your mother disappeared from London, Lady Catherine panicked. She told James that she had received word that Sarah and the baby had died in a car accident in America. James was devastated, but he eventually began to suspect the story was false. Marcus continued reading through the correspondence. The progression was heartbreaking. Initial letters showed James accepting his aunt's story, then gradually expressing doubt. By 1990, he was openly questioning Lady Catherine's account and beginning his own investigation. I can find no death certificates, no accident reports, no hospital records, James had written to one investigator. Either the woman I love is alive somewhere, or my aunt has been more thorough in her deception than I thought possible. If Sarah is alive, I need to find her. If she's not, I need proof so I can finally grieve properly. The police report from James's accident made for difficult reading. He had been driving through heavy rain on a winding Scottish road, returning from a meeting with investigators who believed they had found a promising lead. A truck driver had seen James's car cross the center line and collide with a stone barrier. The investigation concluded that he had likely fallen asleep at the wheel after driving for several hours. But there's more, Whitmore said, opening another folder. These are Lady Catherine's private papers from that time period. She knew exactly what James was doing. The documents revealed a systematic campaign of deception that had lasted for nearly 3 years. Lady Catherine had been monitoring James's investigation efforts and actively working to undermine them. She had contacted detective agencies using false names, provided misleading information, and even had false documents created to support her claims about Sarah and Marcus's supposed deaths. Why would she go to such lengths? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand the answer. Because by 1990, she realized she had made a terrible mistake, but she was trapped by her own lies. James was becoming suspicious and increasingly determined to find the truth. Lady Catherine was terrified of what would happen when he discovered the extent of her deception. Marcus found a letter Lady Catherine had written to her own lawyer in February 1991, just days after intercepting his mother's phone call. James is getting too close to the truth, she had written. The Edinburgh investigators believe they may have located Sarah Thompson in Ohio. If James finds her, he will learn that I lied about everything. He will discover that his child is alive and that I deliberately separated them. I cannot bear to lose him, but I fear I may lose him anyway when he learns what I've done. The final document in the file was perhaps the most devastating of all. It was a letter James had written to Lady Catherine, dated just 2 days before his death. Aunt Catherine, I know you've been lying to me about Sarah and our child. The investigators in Edinburgh have found evidence that contradicts everything you told me. I'm going to Scotland tomorrow to review their findings, and then I'm flying to America to find my family. When I return, we need to discuss why you felt it was necessary to deceive me about the most important thing in my life. Marcus set the letter down and walked to the window, looking out at the estate grounds where his father had grown up. James Pembroke had died on his way to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. He had been just hours away from discoveries that would have led him to Sarah and Marcus. "Does my mother know about this?" Marcus asked. "Lady Catherine's instructions were that you should decide what your mother needs to know." She felt that Sarah had suffered enough, and that revealing the full extent of her deception might cause more pain than healing. That afternoon, Marcus walked alone through the estate's gardens, trying to process the magnitude of what he had learned. His father hadn't simply died in an accident. He had died while actively searching for the son he never knew existed and the woman he still loved. Lady Catherine's lies had evolved from a moment of prejudice into a complex web of deception that had ultimately contributed to her nephew's death. When he returned to the house, he found Mrs. Harrison waiting for him in the library. "Mr. Whitmore told me you've learned about your father's investigation," she said gently. "I wanted you to know that Lady Catherine was never the same after James died. She blamed herself completely." "She should have," Marcus said, more harshly than he intended. "Yes, sir, she should have. But I also want you to understand that the guilt nearly destroyed her. She spent the remaining years of her life trying to find ways to honor James's memory and make amends for what she had done." Mrs. Harrison led Marcus to another section of the library, where she showed him a collection of scrapbooks that Lady Catherine had maintained for over 30 years. "Every newspaper article about your academic achievements," Mrs. Harrison explained, opening the first volume. "Every mention of your mother's diner in local papers, every photograph the investigators were able to obtain. Lady Catherine followed your lives obsessively, as if she could somehow be part of your family from a distance." The scrapbooks were meticulously maintained, showing a level of attention that bordered on obsession. There were photos of Marcus at his high school graduation, newspaper clippings about his mother's community service awards, even copies of his college transcripts that had somehow been obtained. "She knew everything about us but never reached out," Marcus said. "She tried to many times. She wrote hundreds of letters to your mother that were never sent. She planned trips to America that were never taken. But she was paralyzed by the magnitude of what she had done. How do you explain to someone that their child's father died searching for them when you're the reason he couldn't find them?" That evening, Marcus found himself in James's study, which had been maintained exactly as it was at the time of his death. The desk still held his father's fountain pens, his reading glasses, and a half-finished manuscript about rural development strategies that would never be completed. In the desk's bottom drawer, Marcus discovered something that Mrs. Harrison hadn't mentioned: a collection of unsent letters addressed to Sarah Thompson, dated from 1990 until just weeks before James's death. "My dearest Sarah," read the first letter. "I don't know where you are or if you're still alive, but I can't stop hoping that somehow these words will reach you. Catherine told me you died, but my heart refuses to believe it. If you're reading this, please know that I never stopped loving you, never stopped thinking about the life we planned together." The letters chronicled James's growing desperation and determination to find his lost family. They revealed a man who had been transformed from someone uncomfortable with his privileged position into someone willing to fight for the love he had lost. "I've hired my 5th investigative firm," read a letter from 1991. "Each one tells me the same thing: there's no evidence that you and our child died in any accident. I'm beginning to understand that Catherine may have orchestrated your disappearance. If I'm right, if you're alive somewhere raising our child, then I will find you. I promise you that." The final letter, dated just a week before his death, was the most heartbreaking. "Sarah, I may be close to finding you. The investigators in Scotland believe they've traced you to Ohio. By the time you read this, I may already be on my way to America. I know 3 years is a long time, and I know I have no right to expect that you've waited for me. But if there's any chance that you still care for me, if there's any possibility that we might build the family we dreamed about, then I'm coming home to you." Marcus wiped away tears he hadn't realized were falling. His father had died believing he was about to be reunited with the woman he loved and the child he had never known. The crash hadn't been a simple accident. It had been the tragic end to a desperate search that might have succeeded if it had lasted just a few more days. The next morning, Marcus called his mother and told her he needed to see her immediately. "I'm booking you a flight to London," he said. "There are things you need to know, things you need to see, and I think it's time for you to visit the place where you should have been living all along." Sarah arrived 3 days later, looking nervous and overwhelmed as she stepped out of the car at Pembroke Manor. Marcus watched his mother's face as she took in the grandeur of the estate, and he saw a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite identify. "This is where James grew up?" she asked quietly. "This is where we should have grown up," Marcus replied. "Mom, there's a lot we need to talk about." He led her to the library, where he had arranged all the documents and photographs in chronological order. For the next several hours, Marcus walked his mother through everything he had discovered. He showed her James's love letters, his search efforts, and the evidence of Lady Catherine's systematic deception. Sarah listened in stunned silence, occasionally picking up a document or photograph to examine more closely. When Marcus finished his account, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what she had learned. "He never stopped looking for us," she finally said. "No, he died on his way to find us. And Lady Catherine knew all along that we were alive. She knew everything. She followed our lives for decades, helped us financially when she could, but never had the courage to tell the truth." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where James had played as a child. "I spent 35 years thinking he had forgotten about me, moved on with his life. I taught you to believe that your father was someone who didn't want us. None of that was your fault. You believed what you were told by people you thought you could trust. But what if I had tried harder to reach him? What if I had come back to England, demanded to speak with him directly?" Marcus joined his mother at the window. "Lady Catherine had resources we couldn't imagine. She would have found ways to prevent you from reaching him, just like she did when you called in 1991. The only person to blame for any of this is her." That afternoon, Mrs. Harrison gave Sarah a tour of the house, showing her the room where James had lived and the spaces where he had spent his time. Sarah's composure finally broke when she saw the engagement ring that had been intended for her. "He was really going to propose," she said through her tears. "According to his journal, he had been planning it for months," Mrs. Harrison confirmed. "He wanted to ask your father's permission first, but when he learned you were pregnant, he decided he couldn't wait any longer." Later that evening, Marcus and Sarah sat together in the library, surrounded by the evidence of a love story that had been deliberately destroyed. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked her son. "Are you going to stay here, take on all of this responsibility?" Marcus considered the question that had been haunting him since his arrival. "I think I have to. Not because Lady Catherine wanted me to, but because James would have wanted me to. All of this work he was passionate about, all these people who depend on the estate, that's part of his legacy. And part of your inheritance." "Yes, but it's more than that. Reading his letters, learning about who he was, I understand now why he felt trapped by his position here, but I also understand why it mattered to him. He wasn't just a wealthy man living off his inheritance. He was trying to use his advantages to help people who didn't have the same opportunities." Sarah nodded slowly. "He always talked about wanting to make a difference in the world. Even when we were planning our simple life in America, he talked about ways we could help people. I want to continue that work, but I want to do it the way he would have done it if he had lived to raise me himself." The next morning, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He called Whitmore and requested an immediate meeting with the estate's board of trustees. "I want to establish a new foundation," Marcus announced at the meeting. "The James and Sarah Pembroke Foundation, focused on supporting families who have been separated by circumstances beyond their control." The trustees, a group of distinguished elderly gentlemen who had been managing the estate's affairs for decades, listened with interest as Marcus outlined his vision. "I want to fund legal aid for families dealing with international custody disputes, support services for single mothers who are struggling to support their children, and educational programs that help people research and connect with family members they've lost touch with. The foundation will be funded by the £5 million Lady Catherine left as compensation for my lost time with my father." One trustee, a man named Sir Robert Ashford, leaned forward with obvious approval. "Your father would be very proud of this proposal, Marcus. He always believed that the family's resources should be used to help people in difficult situations." "There's one more thing," Marcus added. "I want to invite my mother to serve as the foundation's first director. She understands better than anyone what it means to be separated from family by circumstances beyond your control. After the meeting, Marcus and Sarah walked through the village that bordered the estate grounds. The locals recognized Marcus from photographs that had appeared in regional newspapers announcing his arrival, and many stopped to welcome him. "Your father used to walk this same route every Sunday," said an elderly woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who ran the village bakery. "He always stopped to chat with everyone, always asked about our families and our concerns." "He was a good man," added the village postmaster. "When the economy was bad and several families were facing eviction, he quietly arranged for job training programs and emergency funding. Never wanted any credit for it." As they walked back toward the manor house, Marcus realized that his father's legacy wasn't just the estate or the charitable foundations. It was the genuine care he had shown for the people around him, the understanding that privilege came with responsibilities to help others. That evening, Sarah made an announcement that both surprised and delighted her son. "I've decided to accept your offer about the foundation," she said as they sat together in the library. "But I want to do more than just direct the foundation. I want to move to England permanently." "Are you sure? This is a big change from your life in Ohio." "Marcus, I lost 35 years with your father. I lost the chance to raise you in the place where you belonged. I'm not going to lose any more time with my family." As Sarah spoke, Marcus noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the candlelight of the library, surrounded by books and photographs that told the story of James Pembroke's life, his mother looked younger somehow. The worry lines around her eyes seemed less pronounced, and there was a light in her expression that he couldn't remember seeing during his childhood. "You look different here," he told her. "I feel different. For the first time since 1989, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be." The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal preparations and emotional discoveries. Sarah returned to Ohio to arrange for the sale of her house and the transfer of her responsibilities at the diner. Marcus worked with the estate's lawyers to formalize the establishment of the new foundation and to understand all the obligations that came with his inheritance. But it was during this period that Marcus made perhaps the most important discovery of all. While organizing his father's personal papers, he found a sealed envelope that had been overlooked in all the previous investigations. The envelope was addressed to my son in James's handwriting, and it was dated just 3 days before his death. With trembling hands, Marcus opened the envelope and withdrew several pages of elegant script. "My dear son," the letter began, "I am writing this letter not knowing if you exist, not knowing if I will ever be able to give it to you, but needing to put these words down in case fate prevents me from saying them to you directly." Marcus held the letter with shaking hands, hardly daring to breathe as he continued reading his father's words. "I have spent 3 years believing that you and your mother died before I could meet you, but every instinct I possess tells me this isn't true. If you are reading this, then my suspicions were correct, and somehow you have found your way to the place that should have been your home from the beginning." The letter continued for several pages, and with each paragraph, Marcus felt as though he was finally meeting the father he had never known. "I want you to know that not a day has passed since 1989 that I haven't thought about you. When Catherine told me that you and Sarah had died in an accident, something inside me broke. But recently, that broken feeling has been replaced by hope. I've begun to suspect that Catherine's story was false, that she may have driven Sarah away and then lied to me about what happened." Marcus wiped away tears as he read about his father's growing certainty that Lady Catherine had deceived him. "If my suspicions are correct, if you are alive somewhere in the world, then I want you to know that I never chose to abandon you. I never knew you existed until it was too late to find you, but I have been searching ever since. I've spent my inheritance, ignored my responsibilities, and defied Catherine's wishes because finding you and your mother has become the most important thing in my life." The letter went on to describe James's hopes and dreams for their reunion. "I picture you often, wondering what you look like, what kind of person you've become. I imagine teaching you to ride the horses we keep on the estate, showing you the places where I played as a child, introducing you to the work we do here to help others. I wonder if you have my love of literature or your mother's practical wisdom. I wonder if you think about me at all, or if you've grown up believing I didn't want you." James's words revealed a depth of longing that Marcus hadn't fully understood from the search documents alone. "I know that if I find you, you may not want anything to do with me. You may have built a good life without me, and you may not need or want a father who appears after years of absence. But I hope you'll give me the chance to explain what happened, to tell you how much I loved your mother, and to show you that you have always belonged here." The most emotional part of the letter came near the end. "I've made many mistakes in my life, but the biggest was not fighting harder for Sarah when Catherine first objected to our relationship. I was young and uncertain, and I allowed myself to be manipulated by someone who claimed to know what was best for me. I won't make that mistake again. If I find you and your mother, nothing and no one will ever separate us again." James had concluded the letter with instructions that brought fresh tears to Marcus's eyes. "If something happens to me before I can find you, I want you to know that I've changed my will to leave everything to you and your mother. This estate, the foundations, all of it should be yours by right of birth. But more than that, I want you to know that you were wanted, that you were loved before you were even born, and that finding you would have been the greatest joy of my life." At the bottom of the final page, James had included detailed information about a safety deposit box in London that contained additional documents meant specifically for Marcus. The next morning, Marcus and Sarah traveled to London with Whitmore to access the safety deposit box. Inside, they found a collection of items that James had gathered specifically for the son he hoped to find someday. There were photographs of James as a child, copies of his university records, and letters from friends describing his character and interests. But most precious was a small leather journal that James had kept during his search for Sarah and Marcus. "Day 847 of searching," read one entry. "Still no solid leads, but I'm not giving up. I hired a new investigator today, someone who specializes in international cases. He seems more optimistic than the others. Sarah, if you're reading this someday, please know that I never stopped looking." Another entry, written just weeks before his death, showed James's growing excitement about a potential breakthrough. "The Edinburgh team thinks they've found a Sarah Thompson in Cleveland who matches the right age and background. They're sending someone to investigate this week. I can barely sleep thinking that this might finally be the answer I've been praying for." The final entry in the journal was dated the morning of James's death. "I'm driving to Scotland today to review the evidence the investigators have gathered. They believe they've confirmed that Sarah and my child are alive and living in Ohio. If this is true, if I'm really about to find my family, then this may be the last entry I ever write in this journal. The next time I write, it may be to tell you about meeting my son for the first time." Reading his father's words, Marcus felt a profound connection to a man he was only now getting to know. James Pembroke emerged from these pages not as an abstract figure from his mother's stories, but as a real person with fears, hopes, and an unshakable determination to reunite his family. That afternoon, Marcus and Sarah visited the cemetery where James was buried. Lady Catherine had arranged for an elaborate headstone in the family section of an ancient churchyard near the estate. But what struck Marcus most was the fresh flowers that were placed there regularly. "Lady Catherine came here every week for 30 years, Mrs. Harrison had told them. She never missed a visit, regardless of the weather or her health." Standing beside his father's grave, Marcus felt the full weight of the tragedy that had shaped his entire life. James Pembroke had died just days before his search would have succeeded. If he had lived just a little longer, Marcus would have grown up knowing his father, and Sarah would have had the life she had planned with the man she loved. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you," Marcus said quietly, placing his own flowers beside the headstone. Sarah knelt beside the grave and spoke for the first time to the man who had been taken from her 35 years ago. "James, I brought our son home. He's everything you would have wanted him to be: kind, intelligent, and determined to make a difference in the world. I'm sorry we never got to build the life we planned, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, and I raised Marcus to be proud of the father he never got to meet." Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into learning about the estate's operations and the various charitable foundations he had inherited. He discovered that his natural aptitude for organization and financial analysis made him well-suited for the administrative aspects of his new responsibilities. But it was the people he met through the estate's work who truly convinced him that he had found his calling. He visited rural schools that received funding for computer labs, met elderly residents whose heating bills were subsidized during harsh winters, and talked with young people who had received college scholarships that otherwise would have been impossible. Your father started the scholarship program, explained Margaret Hale, who had managed the Educational Foundation for 20 years. He believed that talent existed everywhere, but opportunity did not. He wanted to make sure that bright young people from disadvantaged backgrounds could pursue higher education regardless of their family's financial situation. Marcus learned that James had been particularly interested in supporting students who were the first in their families to attend university, young people whose backgrounds were similar to Sarah's. He often said that some of the most capable people in the world never get the chance to develop their potential because of circumstances beyond their control, Margaret continued. The scholarship program was his way of leveling the playing field, at least for a few dozen students each year. As Marcus delved deeper into his father's charitable work, he began to understand that James Pembroke had been trying to use his privilege to address the same kinds of inequalities that had originally made Lady Catherine disapprove of his relationship with Sarah. He was ahead of his time in many ways, said Dr. William Thornton, who had worked with James on rural healthcare initiatives. While many wealthy families focused their charity on high-profile causes, James was interested in addressing systemic problems that affected ordinary people's daily lives. Marcus decided to expand his father's work in ways that honored both his father's vision and his mother's experiences. He established programs that provided legal aid to families dealing with custody issues, supported single mothers who were pursuing higher education, and created job training programs for people who needed to rebuild their lives after difficult circumstances. But perhaps the most meaningful project was the establishment of a family reunification service, designed to help people who had been separated from relatives by various circumstances. "I want to hire investigators who will help people find their families," Marcus explained to the Foundation's board. "Not everyone has the resources that my father had access to, but everyone deserves the chance to reconnect with the people they love." Sarah proved to be an excellent Foundation director, bringing a practical understanding of the challenges facing working-class families that complemented Marcus's financial and organizational skills. "She understands our clients in ways that someone who grew up with privilege never could," observed Linda Russell, one of the Foundation's social workers. "She's been where they are, she knows what it's like to struggle alone, and she knows how much difference the right kind of help can make." As winter turned to spring, Marcus settled into a routine that felt more natural than anything he had ever experienced in his previous life. He woke up each morning in his father's room, walked through gardens that had been in his family for centuries, and spent his days working on projects that made a tangible difference in people's lives. But it was during a quiet evening in the library that Marcus made a discovery that changed his understanding of Lady Catherine's final months. While organizing some of her papers that had been stored in various locations throughout the house, he found a series of draft letters that Lady Catherine had written to him but never sent. "Dear Marcus," read the first draft, dated 2 years before her death, "I am writing to tell you about your father and to ask for your forgiveness for the terrible mistakes I made when you were born. I don't know how to begin this story or how to explain the fear and prejudice that drove me to separate your family." There were dozens of these drafts, each one representing Lady Catherine's struggle to find words adequate to explain her actions and express her remorse. "I have rehearsed this conversation in my mind thousands of times," read another draft. "I have imagined flying to America to meet you, calling you on the telephone, sending investigators to explain everything on my behalf. But each time I consider actually reaching out to you, I am paralyzed by the magnitude of what I would have to confess." The letters revealed a woman who had been tortured by guilt for decades, desperately wanting to make contact with Marcus, but unable to overcome her fear of his reaction. How do you tell someone that their father died searching for them? How do you explain that you lied for 3 years about their mother's death? How do you ask for forgiveness when you know that your actions were unforgivable? But the final draft, dated just 3 months before Lady Catherine's death, showed a different tone. "Marcus, I am running out of time to make this right, and I have finally found the courage to face what I've done. I cannot give you back your father, cannot restore the years you should have had together, cannot undo the pain I caused your mother. But I can give you the truth, and I can give you the inheritance that should have been yours from birth. I can only hope that, when you learn about your father through his letters and journals, you will understand the kind of man he was, and the kind of man I hope you might choose to become." Reading these unsent letters, Marcus began to see Lady Catherine not as the villain of his family's story, but as a deeply flawed person who had made terrible choices and had spent decades trying to find a way to correct them. "She was afraid of you," Sarah observed when Marcus shared the letters with her. "Afraid that you would hate her, afraid that you would reject the inheritance, afraid that her final attempt to make amends would fail too." "Would I have?" Marcus asked. "If she had approached me directly while she was still alive, would I have been able to forgive her?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I think it would have depended on how she approached you, whether she seemed genuinely remorseful or just wanted to ease her own guilt." "And now that she's gone, how do I feel about her?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I think that's something you need to figure out for yourself. But I will say this. The woman who wrote those letters doesn't sound like the cold aristocrat who drove me away in 1989. She sounds like someone who learned too late that her prejudices had destroyed the people she loved most." That night, Marcus walked through the estate grounds, thinking about forgiveness and redemption, about the difference between understanding someone's actions and excusing them. Lady Catherine had been responsible for tragedies that had affected multiple generations of his family, but she had also spent the final decades of her life trying to honor his father's memory and provide for Marcus's future. When he returned to the house, Marcus found Mrs. Harrison waiting for him in the library. "I have something else to show you," she said, opening a cabinet that Marcus hadn't noticed before. Inside were hundreds of photographs, carefully organized in albums. "Lady Catherine hired photographers to take pictures of your life from a distance," Mrs. Harrison explained. "Your high school graduation, your first day at your job, your mother receiving a community service award. She wanted to see your life, even if she couldn't be part of it." The photographs were both touching and disturbing. They showed a woman desperate to maintain some connection to the family she had driven away, but doing so in a way that violated their privacy. "She knew it was wrong," Mrs. Harrison said. "She often said she felt like a criminal, spying on people who should have been part of her family, but she couldn't stop herself. Watching your life from afar was the only way she could cope with what she had done." Among the photographs, Marcus found pictures of himself that he remembered being taken: his college graduation, a company picnic, a charity run he had participated in. At the time, he had assumed they were official photographers or just other attendees with cameras. Now he realized that Lady Catherine had been there, watching from a distance, documenting milestones in the life of the nephew she had never been able to claim. "The irony," Mrs. Harrison said, "is that Lady Catherine ended up knowing more about your daily life than many parents know about their adult children. She knew about your volunteer work, your reading habits, your friendships. She followed your life obsessively because she couldn't bear the emptiness of not knowing anything about you." As Marcus looked through the photographs, he began to understand something he hadn't expected. Despite her terrible decisions and their devastating consequences, Lady Catherine had genuinely loved him. Her methods had been inappropriate and her earlier actions unforgivable, but the woman who had spent 30 years documenting his life from afar had cared about him deeply. This realization didn't excuse what she had done, but it added another layer of complexity to his feelings about his inheritance and his role as head of the Pembroke family. 1 year after arriving at Pembroke Manor, Marcus stood in the same library where he had first learned the truth about his family's history. The room looked different now, warmer somehow, with fresh flowers from the estate's gardens and photographs of his parents displayed alongside the formal portraits of previous generations. Sarah had officially moved to England 3 months earlier, taking up residence in a renovated cottage on the estate grounds. She had brought with her the few mementos from their old life in Ohio, but she seemed to have no regrets about leaving her former existence behind. "I feel like I'm finally living in the present instead of grieving for the past," she had told Marcus just days before. The James and Sarah Pembroke Foundation had exceeded all expectations in its first year of operation. They had reunited 17 families who had been separated by various circumstances, provided legal aid to 43 single mothers, and awarded scholarships to 32 first-generation college students. But perhaps the most meaningful success was a case that had arrived just 2 weeks earlier. A young woman named Elena Vasquez had contacted the foundation asking for help in finding her father, who had been deported when she was 12 years old. The foundation's investigators had located him in Mexico City, and Elena was planning to travel there for their reunion. "It's exactly the kind of work your father would have wanted to do," Sarah had said when they discussed the case. Marcus had spent the morning preparing for a special event, the dedication of a memorial garden in James's honor. The project had been his idea, a way to create something beautiful while acknowledging the tragedy that had brought him to this place. The garden was located in a quiet corner of the estate, designed around a reflecting pool with benches where visitors could sit quietly. At the center stood a simple stone monument engraved with words from one of James's letters. Love perseveres across any distance and survives any separation. Representatives from all the charities and organizations that James had supported were expected to attend, along with local residents whose lives had been touched by the Pembroke family's philanthropy. But as Marcus walked through the garden one final time before the ceremony, he wasn't thinking about the guests or the speeches that would be given. He was thinking about a letter he had received that morning from a most unexpected source. The letter had come from Scotland Yard, forwarded through Jonathan Whitmore's office. It was from Detective Inspector Robert MacLeod, who had investigated James's accident 35 years earlier. "Mr. Thompson," the letter began, "I hope you will forgive an old policeman for reaching out after so many years, but I read about your arrival at Pembroke Manor in the newspapers, and there's something I believe you should know about your father's death." MacLeod explained that he was now retired, but had never forgotten the case because something about it had always bothered him. "Your father was driving to meet with my nephew, Colin MacLeod, who was working as a private investigator in Edinburgh at the time. Colin had called your father the morning of the accident to tell him that they had confirmed the location of his former girlfriend and child in America. Your father was so excited by the news that he insisted on driving up that same day, despite the weather warnings." The detective's letter continued with details that hadn't been included in the official police report. "Colin told me that your father had been preparing for this moment for years. He had already purchased airline tickets to America, had drafted letters to your mother explaining everything that had happened, and had even consulted with lawyers about international custody arrangements. He wasn't just searching for you. He was ready to completely restructure his life to be.